What does one do to convert to Buddhism?
Since Buddhist tradition generally does not emphasize doctrine, becoming a Buddhist ordinarily does not involve lengthy periods of education or examination on the teachings. Various Buddhist organizations do, however, produce catechism-like texts designed for beginners interested in joining the faith. There is no universally practiced ritual for welcoming converts. Perhaps the single most important ritual element in the process of becoming a Buddhist is the taking of the 3 refuges. Many who decide to become Buddhists seek the tutelage of a spiritual guide. Especially in the various Zen and Tibetan organizations. Unlike converts to some other traditions, new Buddhists seem to be less concerned with seeking salvation than with finding a personally satisfying approach to everyday life. It is perhaps ironic that a tradition that de-emphasizes doctrine attracts more people committed to studying the tradition in depth than do many traditions in which doctrine plays a more central role. Above all, Buddhists almost universally agree that nothing in any religious doctrinal system leads to salvation in itself.
What does one do to convert to Buddhism?
Since Buddhist tradition generally does not emphasize doctrine, becoming a Buddhist ordinarily does not involve lengthy periods of education or examination on the teachings. Various Buddhist organizations do, however, produce catechism-like texts designed for beginners interested in joining the faith. There is no universally practiced ritual for welcoming converts. Perhaps the single most important ritual element in the process of becoming a Buddhist is the taking of the 3 refuges. Many who decide to become Buddhists seek the tutelage of a spiritual guide. Especially in the various Zen and Tibetan organizations. Unlike converts to some other traditions, new Buddhists seem to be less concerned with seeking salvation than with finding a personally satisfying approach to everyday life. It is perhaps ironic that a tradition that de-emphasizes doctrine attracts more people committed to studying the tradition in depth than do many traditions in which doctrine plays a more central role. Above all, Buddhists almost universally agree that nothing in any religious doctrinal system leads to salvation in itself.
What are some of the main features of Buddhism's relationships to other traditions?
Buddhism's most important connections historically have been with Hinduism, out of which it grew, and the major indigenous traditions of the Asian lands to which it spread. Over the centuries, Buddhists have therefore interacted primarily with Hindus, Deists, Confucians, and adherents of Shinto. An earlier question outlined crucial features Buddhism's relationship to Hinduism. Here are some features of Buddhism's conceptual connections with the other traditions. China's ancient deist tradition made room for the Buddha among the swelling ranks of its deities. Even claiming that foundational figure Lao Zi had himself become a Buddha. Dharma, some scholars argued, was the Buddhist analogy to the concept of the way or Dao. They suggested further parallels between the Buddhist Arhat and the deist immortal, and between nirvana and the concept of non-action. Confucian tradition also found ways of accommodating to the newcomer. Some scholars saw in Buddhist ethics a parallel to Confucian filial piety. Even though Buddhist elevation of celibate monasticism seemed quite irreconcilable with the Confucian emphasis on family life. To Buddhism's 5 precepts some likened Confucianism's 5 constant virtues. When Buddhist missionaries brought the new teaching to Japan, the Buddha met the kami, high beings, of the indigenous tradition called Shinto. As was so often the case in China and elsewhere, Buddhism's ability to survive and grow in its new environment depended a great deal on royal patronage. Imperial support gave impetus to various Buddhist Shinto accommodations. Shinto's sun goddess, Amaterasu, became a counterpart to the Buddha of infinite light, Vairochana. Hachiman, Shinto deity of war, dressed as a Buddhist monk and became the guardian of the great Buddha. And in Mahayana teachings multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas some saw parallels to Shinto's countless kami. Representatives of various Buddhist denominations have continued active dialogue with other traditions, especially through the monastic connection.
What are some of the main features of Buddhism's relationships to other traditions?
Buddhism's most important connections historically have been with Hinduism, out of which it grew, and the major indigenous traditions of the Asian lands to which it spread. Over the centuries Buddhists have therefore interacted primarily with Hindus, deists, Confucians, and adherents of Shinto. An earlier question outlined crucial features Buddhism's relationship to Hinduism. Here are some features of Buddhism's conceptual connections with the other traditions. China's ancient deist tradition made room for the Buddha among the swelling ranks of its deities. Even claiming that foundational figure Lao Zi had himself become a Buddha. Dharma, some scholars argued, was the Buddhist analogy to the concept of the way or Dao. They suggested further parallels between the Buddhist Arhat and the deist immortal, and between nirvana and the concept of non-action. Confucian tradition also found ways of accommodating to the newcomer. Some scholars saw in Buddhist ethics a parallel to Confucian filial piety. Even though Buddhist elevation of celibate monasticism seemed quite irreconcilable with the Confucian emphasis on family life. To Buddhism's 5 precepts some likened Confucianism's 5 constant virtues. When Buddhist missionaries brought the new teaching to Japan, the Buddha met the kami, high beings, of the indigenous tradition called Shinto. As was so often the case in China and elsewhere, Buddhism's ability to survive and grow in its new environment depended a great deal on royal patronage. Imperial support gave impetus to various Buddhist Shinto accommodations. Shinto's sun goddess, Amaterasu, became a counterpart to the Buddha of infinite light, Vairochana. Hachiman, Shinto deity of war, dressed as a Buddhist monk and became the guardian of the great Buddha. And in Mahayana teachings multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas some saw parallels to Shinto's countless kami. Representatives of various Buddhist denominations have continued active dialogue with other traditions, especially through the monastic connection.
How and where do members of local Buddhist communities come together?
Temples are the focal point of Buddhist activity in most places. Many temples are freestanding institutions, while others are part of larger monastic complexes. At the heart of the temple is the primary ritual space. Some can accommodate sizable groups, but since ordinary Buddhist ritual tends to be an individual matter, central worship spaces are generally not strikingly capacious. Larger temples nowadays often have other facilities dedicated to communal functions on special occasions. People might visit their local temples individually or in smaller groups at any time on any day.
How and where do members of local Buddhist communities come together?
Temples are the focal point of Buddhist activity in most places. Many temples are freestanding institutions, while others are part of larger monastic complexes. At the heart of the temple is the primary ritual space. Some can accommodate sizable groups, but since ordinary Buddhist ritual tends to be an individual matter, central worship spaces are generally not strikingly capacious. Larger temples nowadays often have other facilities dedicated to communal functions on special occasions. People might visit their local temples individually or in smaller groups at any time on any day.
How does the Buddhist tradition describe existence in general?
Buddhist teaching focuses on three fundamental qualities of all things. Two are fairly obvious to anyone who cares to look, and are at the heart of the experience of enlightenment. The first is hardship or suffering, the second impermanence. Nobody is immune to sadness and disappointment. No one has a lock on success and genuine contentment. And everything comes to an end. Everything. The third quality is far from obvious even to the most careful observer. But an awareness of it does follow from the realities of suffering and impermanence. That is the notion that there is no permanent, indestructible core or soul at the center of any being. Hindu tradition taught Siddhartha Gautama that at the center of each individual being was a self or Atman that survived physical death to be reincarnated in another life. Assuming the person died still enslaved by the effects of self-centered choices. The Buddha's reinterpretation of Hindu tradition on this point was so radical that it cuts right to the psychological bone.
Take away the soul and what remains?
Nothing, apparently. But the Buddha was not attempting to empty life of its meaning. He wanted people to change their minds about what matters most. Look hard at what motivates you. What can make you nearly desperate to achieve this good or avoid that evil? Look carefully, the Buddha argued. And you will see that the qualities that attract or repel you are deceptions. Probe deeply into your choices and you will see that what you are really looking for you cannot get from this possession or that person. Each being is simply what it is, and it is a serious mistake to treat your world as though it existed for you. As if what you value in each thing is its value. In a sense, the Buddha argued, all things are empty. In that they simply do not possess the soul that a grasping, craving person invests them with. Pile all your expectations onto some person or object as though you truly hope it will deliver what you want. And you are making the fundamental mistake. The notion of non-soul, anatman, is difficult to understand. But it is one of the Buddha's most provocative teachings.
Are there any Buddhist holy sites or cities?
Important to Buddhists universally are the places associated with central events in the life of the Buddha. Sites identified with his birth, the Lumbini Grove, Enlightenment, Bodh Gaya. First sermon, the Deer Park near Benares, and entering into Nirvana, Kushanagara, are at the top of the list. Pilgrims from all over the world now travel to India. On pilgrimage to these and dozens of other locations of slightly lesser importance. No one city in India functions for Buddhists quite the way Mecca, Jerusalem, and Rome do for Muslims, Jews, and many Christians. Various cities have become associated with important Buddhist temples and monasteries. But they have rarely if ever attracted pilgrims precisely as cities. Instead, pilgrims head for specific sites and temples. Outside India, dozens of places are sacred to members of the various Buddhist denominations. Many are associated with mountains. Ancient pre-Buddhist traditions in both China and Japan, for example, attributed supreme sanctity to the high places that, according to some spiritual maps, marked the outer limits of the cosmos at the cardinal points. Different sects and lineages often chose mountains for their spiritual centers because of the centrality of Mt Meru in ancient Hindu myth. Mountains symbolize a point of interconnection among the several levels of the cosmos. They also can be readily imagined as huge mandalas around which spiritual seekers circumambulate en route to the center.
Are there other important cyclical observances based largely on celestial signs?
Every 3 years Hindus gather from all over India in one of 4 sacred cities: Hardwar, Prayaga, Ujjain, and Nasik, each on a different sacred river or confluence, for a huge religious fair called a Kumbh Mela, Grainpot Festival. The mythological connection in the name is its reference to the kumbha, or vessel, from which drops of the nectar of immortality fell as the demons rested on their flight from the gods, making the 4 cities holy. Every 12 years, a series of astrological conjunctions make the gathering at Prayaga, known by Muslims as Allahabad, particularly auspicious. Since about the 8th century, travelers have made organized pilgrimages to the 4 cities to attain forgiveness of sins for themselves and 88 generations of ancestors by bathing in their sacred waters 4 times each year, corresponding to the 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. Are particularly important events in the solar calendar. The beginning of every solar month is auspicious because of the sun's move into a new sign of the zodiac. But the winter solstice is the most important because it signals the lengthening of days and the beginning of the solar year.
Do Vaishnavites have special feasts in honor of Vishnu or his avatars?
Rama Navami, Rama 9th, during Chaitra in early spring, celebrates Rama's birthday. During a 9-day festival, celebrants attend a lengthy retelling of the massive epic Ramayana. A related feast occurs on the 15th of Shravan, a full moon celebration of Rama's crossing over to Lanka to rescue Sita. 2 major feasts focus on Krishna. Krishna Janmashtami, birthday. 8th during the dark half of Shravan, in late summer, celebrates Krishna's birthday. For a full 7 days devotees reenact events from Krishna's life. The festivities culminate with a fast and midnight worship on the 7th day, the eve of the birthday. Naga Panchami, Serpent 5th, so named because it occurs on the 5th day of Shravan's bright half, comes in late summer and recalls one of Krishna's many victories over embodiments of evil. His dispatching of the serpent demon Kaliya in the river Jumna. Although the evil demon in this case is a serpent. The fast and feast celebrate the grace represented by other cosmically beneficial serpents as well. Several feasts also recall other specific avatars. For example, on the full moon of Kartika, some Vaishnavites celebrate Vishnu's descent as the Savi or fish Matsya.
What is the celebration called Diwali?
Diwali is one of the most important and widely celebrated of all Hindu observances. Also called Deepavali, or Row of Lights, this feast occurs in mid-autumn, October or November, technically from the 13th of Ashvina's dark half to the 2nd of Kartika's bright half. composed of 5 distinct day-long festivities devoted to such mythic events as Krishna's conquest of 2 demons and Shiva's reconciliation with Parvati. Shaivites and Vaishnavites alike observe the occasion, marking it as theirs by dedicating the middle night of the 5 to either Kali's bringing Shiva under control or Vishnu's consort Lakshmi, respectively. Socially speaking, the feast belongs to the merchant castes. Diwali, strictly so called, occurs on the 4th day, recalling Rama's return to his royal throne in Ayodhya to end his 14-year exile.
What are some of the main features of Buddhism's relationships to other traditions?
Buddhism's most important connections historically have been with Hinduism, out of which it grew, and the major indigenous traditions of the Asian lands to which it spread. Over the centuries, Buddhists have therefore interacted primarily with Hindus, Deists, Confucians, and adherents of Shinto. An earlier question outlined crucial features Buddhism's relationship to Hinduism. Here are some features of Buddhism's conceptual connections with the other traditions. China's ancient deist tradition made room for the Buddha among the swelling ranks of its deities, even claiming that foundational figure Lao Tzu had himself become a Buddha. Dharma, some scholars argued, was the Buddhist analogy to the concept of the way or Deo. They suggested further parallels between the Buddhist Arhat and the deist immortal, and between nirvana and the concept of non-action. Confucian tradition also found ways of accommodating to the newcomer. Some scholars saw in Buddhist ethics a parallel to Confucian filial piety. Even though Buddhist elevation of celibate monasticism seemed quite irreconcilable with the Confucian emphasis on family life. To Buddhism's 5 precepts some likened Confucianism's 5 constant virtues. When Buddhist missionaries brought the new teaching to Japan, the Buddha met the kami, high beings, of the indigenous tradition called Shinto. As was so often the case in China and elsewhere, Buddhism's ability to survive and grow in its new environment depended a great deal on royal patronage. Imperial support gave impetus to various Buddhist Shinto accommodations. Shinto's sun goddess, Amaterasu, became a counterpart to the Buddha of infinite light, Vairochana. Hachiman, Shinto deity of war, dressed as a Buddhist monk and became the guardian of the great Buddha. And in Mahayana teachings multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas some saw parallels to Shinto's countless kami. Representatives of various Buddhist denominations have continued active dialogue with other traditions, especially through the monastic connection.
What kind of religious calendar do Hindus observe?
Combining lunar months with seasons of the solar year. The Hindu calendar functions somewhat like the Jewish. About every 3 years it inserts an extra month after a month with 2 new moons. Hindu lunar months vary from 29 to 32 days. The names of the months, with the roughly corresponding Gregorian months in parentheses, are as follows. Chatra, March/April, Vaishakha, April/May, Jyastha, May/June, Asade, June/July, Shravan, July/August. Bhadrapada, August/September, Ashvina, September/October, Kartika, October/November, Margasivsa. November/December, Pansa, December/January, Magha, January/February, and Falguna, February/March. Leap months take the name of the month preceding them. For ritual purposes, each month is divided into its dark and light halves, with associated celebrations. And the moment of full moon is a special time of celebration each month. And some festivals and observances fall each year on the same solar date. Each year is likened to a day in the life of the deities, with the solar solstices symbolizing sunrise and sundown. In addition to the complexity introduced by the blending of solar and lunar reckonings, systems vary still further from region to region in India. Historically, the greater Hindu religious calendar has been so full that virtually every day some Hindu community has celebrated something special somewhere in the subcontinent. Hinduism is not unlike Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions in that respect, except that the majority of the Christian religious feasts are those of saints, rather than of the deity as such. All of this makes for an immensely rich sense of the intersection of sacred times and places. Every day is appropriate for religious observance, and no one day of the week is set aside as an especially sacred time.
Who are Vajrayana Buddhists?
Vajrayana Buddhism consists of a number of schools and lineages that blended Mahayana concepts with the esoteric interpretations of Hinduism's tantric schools. Local pre-Buddhist elements of shamanism and folk religion gave further distinctiveness to the different schools. In some places, Vajrayana, also called Tantrayana, esoteric vehicle, has blended with popular traditions. In the monasteries, the monks and mystical adepts engage in arcane rituals open only to initiates. But the monks also minister to the public through more accessible teaching and worship. Monastic institutions have dominated much of everyday life in the Himalayan nations and, until recently, to a greater degree than elsewhere in Asia. Many of the largest and most powerful monasteries are perched high above cities and villages, so that their physical setting is itself an unmistakable symbol of their centrality. Before the Chinese takeover of Tibet, as many as 1 out of 5 Tibetans were monks or nuns. Some half a dozen major monastic orders developed, of which the Dalai Lama's Gelugpa order is now the best known. Vajrayana Buddhists developed their own extensive sacred scriptures, largely by way of translation of Indian Sanskrit and Chinese texts. In 108 volumes the Kanjur, translation of the word, includes monastic regulations along with philosophy. The 225-volume Tanjir, translation of treatises, includes sutras, tantras, and commentaries on them. Perhaps most distinctive of the various Vajrayana schools is the use of special ritual symbolism and meditative techniques to achieve their spiritual objectives. Visualization techniques and highly developed forms of chanting assist the meditator toward union with the divine center. Outside Tibet and the other Himalayan nations, Vajrayana tradition exercised considerable influence on the increasingly esoteric Japanese Shingon school.
Who are Mahayana Buddhists?
By contrast, Mahayana Buddhists belong to a wide variety of sub-communities, for whom the historical Buddha called Siddhartha Gautama was one of many manifestations of enlightenment capable of saving those who ask for help. Mahayana scriptures evolved in some half-dozen languages over many centuries as the tradition moved through Asia. Mahayana teaching universalized a number of classical Buddhist concepts, broadening their popular appeal and expanding the religious options available to ordinary folk. For example, Mahayana teaching regarded the historical Buddha of this age, Siddhartha Gautama, as only one of many embodiments of enlightenment. Not merely an ethical model, the Buddha was actually a world-filling spiritual presence and power. The compassionate bodhisattva supplanted the more self-contained arhat as a religious ideal. Bodhisattvas represented saving grace as well as a lofty goal to which any person might aspire. Mahayana teachings expanded still further by personifying wisdom as a feminine principle, attractive and accessible. At the same time, somewhat paradoxically, Mahayana tradition was also a great deal more open to the sort of speculative thinking most Theravadins considered fruitless. Mahayana philosophers developed the concept of emptiness, shunyata, for example, as a way of emphasizing the futility of clinging to anything at all, even to neat doctrinal distinctions. Of the dozen or so Mahayana schools and denominations that arose in India, China, and Japan, two deserve special mention here. First and most popular are the Pure Land communities. Amitabha, Amida in Japan, one of the 5 transcendent or meditational Buddhas, rules the Western paradise called the Pure Land. Devotees seek rebirth in that heavenly realm through various spiritual means, including the simple repetition of phrases such as "Glory to Amida Buddha." In addition, several major Chan, Zen in Japan, lineages have been extraordinarily influential in Eastern Asia. The Soto school emphasizes quiet, methodical meditation, while the Rinzai school uses, in addition, the mind-stopping device called the koan to hasten the seeker's experience of enlightenment.
What are some of the regular monthly religious observances?
The Hindu sense of sacred time presents an enormous array of possibilities, depending on various combinations of astrological phenomena. Auspicious days of the week, and associations of times with particular deities. Different days in both dark and bright fortnights of each lunar month carry generic spiritual values. Most sacred is the 11th day, while the 1st, 4th, 9th, and 14th are inauspicious. Some days are consecrated to different deities. More special occasions fall during the bright than during the dark half. During one half, both halves in some months and/or regions, the 4th day belongs to Ganesha, the 8th to Durga, the 9th and 11th to Vishnu, a solar deity, and the 13th to Shiva, a lunar deity. New moon days find some Hindus offering special meals to placate the spirits of the dead. Many of these monthly or semi-monthly occasions include a fast. Most Hindus observe only some of these special days, depending on their sectarian affiliation.
Have relics been important in Buddhist practice?
Practically since the Buddha's final entry into nirvana, which coincided with his physical death. Buddhists have placed great importance on sacred relics. Numerous early accounts tell of the distribution of Buddha's cremated remains to political rulers so that they could enshrine them as sacred markers. One account says the great King Ashoka built 84,000 stupas as reliquaries for the Buddha's ashes. Some sources report that Buddha's followers discovered among the ashes a tooth, still intact. In Kandy, Sri Lanka, the shrine of the tooth claims to possess the only authentic dental relic, said to have been brought there 10 days after Buddha's death. But as recently as the late 1990s, a tooth kept in Beijing made news when it was flown to Hong Kong after the Chinese takeover there, in time for a celebration of the Buddha's birthday. Meanwhile, a tooth in the possession of a Tibetan monk was installed in Taipei, Taiwan. Amid mainland Chinese denunciations of its authenticity. Other relics of the Buddha included his staff, begging bowl, and robe. Another item that reflects the sacredness of first-class, actual bodily remains. And second-class relics, personal effects of the sacred person. And is still important throughout the Buddhist world is the Buddha's footprint. Many temples claim to possess an actual print, but most are highly stylized stone or metal images that devotees bathe with various liquids and adorn with flower petals. Prints frequently have various symbols of the Buddha on the sole. Most common are the wheel of the law and sets of either 32, 100, and 8. Or 132 special marks of the Enlightened One. Footprints belong to a third category of relic, items that directly remind one of the Buddha. All images of the Buddha, as well as physical copies of the sacred texts, are therefore also a type of relic. In addition to relics of the Buddha himself, symbolic reminders of numerous other holy persons have become prominent. First and second class relics of bodhisattvas, patriarchs, and eminent monastic founders and teachers are enshrined in stupas and pagodas throughout Asia. Miniature stupas and pagodas, made of wood, stone, or metal, have often provided the visual and devotional focus in temples, monasteries, and even private dwellings.
Are there mythic elements in Buddhist tradition?
Mythic expression plays a far less central role in Buddhist teaching than in Hinduism. In fact, you might say one of the Buddha's main concerns was to demythologize Hindu tradition as he had received it. Hindu myth introduces believers to the impenetrable mystery of the divine while attempting to describe how the divine presence infuses the world of human experience. The Buddha cautioned against taking refuge in myth. However potent the divine presence may be, it does not relieve human beings of ultimate responsibility for their own choices. As in so many religious traditions, the foundational figure himself soon became the focal point of a new mythology. Even the most hardcore Theravada tradition leaves room for the Buddha to expand into a being of supramundane qualities. Wondrous tales of the Buddha's previous lives, the Jatakas, radiate mythic energy. Some of the Mahayana denominations and sects, those of the widely popular Pure Land variety in particular, evolved their own complex descriptions of a multi-level cosmos, ruled by multiple Buddhas and populated by countless lesser spiritual powers as well. Vajrayana Buddhism, represented especially by various Tibetan lineages, retained much of ancient Hinduism's mythic spirit and cast of characters. But the Tibetans interiorized the myth, interpreting the many spiritual beings as projections of the inner powers with which one identifies through meditative practice. Even in popular Mahayana and the more esoteric Vajrayana teachings, mythic elements never attain quite the centrality they enjoy in Hindu tradition.
What do Buddhists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
One of the many issues the Buddha refused to speculate on was the existence or significance of gods. As a Hindu, he naturally learned the traditional stories of the divinities. As a man of his time, with all its religious and intellectual ferment, the Buddha questioned the wisdom of reliance on ritual sacrifice. He did not deny the existence of the gods. He merely insisted that whatever power the gods might possess, it could not solve the fundamental human dilemma that remained the sole responsibility of the individual person. Many Buddhist sacred texts talk of the gods in mythic terms. It was, for example, the gods who made sure young Siddhartha Gautama encountered the 4 passing sights that turned his life around. But classical Buddhist teaching does not refer to an ultimate reality in personal terms that changed as popular devotional forms of Buddhism developed, especially in China, Korea, and Japan. Buddha himself assumed virtually divine proportions. And the concept of the universal Buddha nature superseded that of the Buddha as historical human teacher. Gods of ancient Hindu myth retained a place in the Buddhist spiritual cosmos but remained very much in the background.
Do Hindus believe in angels?
Nothing in Hindu lore corresponds exactly to the spiritual beings known in some traditions as angels. But a host of lesser deities, called devatas, and spirits make up the entourages of many of the major deities. These versatile beings are often grouped in families whose mission is to do their deities' every bidding. Like the angels in some traditions, lesser deities fill the spiritual air around the major deities. In popular spirituality, devotees often consider the need to render an account to these divine vanguards nearly equal to their duties to the central deity. For the lesser deities preside over essential areas of life such as fertility, childbirth, and disease. Those that wield more positive energies have their darker counterparts that need to be appeased in order to hold evil at bay. Among the more common beings of this rank are the door guardians, Dvarapalas, who keep undesirable elements out of temples and away from the shrines of the deities to whom they are assigned. Door guardians are often depicted with iconographic clues very similar to those of their major deities. So, for example, guardians in a Vaishnavite temple typically have 4 arms and are equipped with Vishnu's conch shell, discus, and mace.
Who are Theravada Buddhists?
Theravada Buddhists are members of a more or less homogeneous community of faith and worship built around the notion that the Buddha was a human being who taught by example. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was the last of many non-human and human reincarnations of the Buddha to be a separate school from the Second Council on in the 4th century BCE. Their main scriptures are called collectively the Pali Canon. Theravadins seek deliverance from rebirth by eliminating craving and ignorance through self-discipline. The ideal and model of the enlightened life is the Arhat. Arhats benefit others chiefly by their example, and they possess no saving power as such. They embody primarily the virtue of wisdom. Their ultimate goal, nirvana, is a state beyond this world of samsara in which the liberated person experiences neither desire nor impressions of any kind. Theravada sources describe nirvana as a permanent pleasant state of knowledge, freedom, and peace that is largely the result of a process of personal effort. When Theravadins pray, their primary intent is more to honor the Buddha than to worship him. All good acts, including religious ritual, done with proper intent can help one gain merit toward the eradication of negative karma. For most Theravada Buddhists, the concepts of merit making and merit transfer are more basic. and accessible than the kind of lofty ethical and spiritual discipline embodied in an arhat. There are, of course, some regional and cultural variations in Theravada expression and practice, but considerably less so than in the other main branches of Buddhist tradition.
Who are some important women in the history of Hindu spirituality?
Ancient tradition acknowledges that some anonymous women were among the authors of the Vedic hymns. Many other women whose names we know have made major contributions throughout the history of Hinduism. Here is a brief introduction to 4 of the better-known women from various denominations. Antal, 725–55 CE, was one of the Alvars, poet saints in the Vaishnava tradition. She was most famous for poetry in which she described her relationship with Vishnu in the language of bridal mysticism. Seeing herself as the spouse of Vishnu, she shares the spiritual longing of women mystics in other traditions who speak of total loving union with God. Devotees still sing hymns that set her poems to music. Mahadevi was a 12th century devotee of Shiva and a renowned poet in the Kannada language. In the temple of her village, the principal deity was a form of Shiva called Mallikarjun, Lord White as Jasmine. Like Antal, she thought of herself as betrothed to God alone. She was apparently forced into an unhappy marriage, and much of her poetry alludes to the suffering she experienced and her longing to be liberated and live for God alone. A late medieval holy woman named Mirabai, 1498–1550, was a devotee of Krishna. She thought of herself as a gopi who had been hopelessly enamored of the dark Lord. After extricating herself from an unsatisfactory marriage, she became a sannyasi and composed love songs in Hindi, a vernacular tongue in west-central India. Finally, a woman known by the honorific title Anandamayi Ma, bliss-steeped mother, lived in modern-day Bengal, now Bangladesh. Nirmala Sundari, 1896–1982, lived a most colorful life, often flouting strict tradition in favor of sometimes highly symbolic or ecstatic behavior. In her later years she opted for a more settled life, founding an ashram and ministering to disciples who sought her out for spiritual guidance.
Is there a distinctively Buddhist ethic?
Compassion for all sentient beings is the overriding principle in Buddhist ethics. It was compassion, karuna, that urged the Buddha to share his message of enlightenment. Life's greatest challenge is to act out of genuine altruism, to be and do for others without hoping for reward. Compassion needs to be doubly disciplined. One needs to work toward the alleviation of suffering purely because that is humanity's highest calling. But it is also essential to know how best to put compassion into action. That calls for the practical wisdom that comes from a keen awareness of one's own spiritual history. including a recollection of one's previous lives. The ability to recall one's former existences is a mark of genuine enlightenment and a sign of profound awareness. Buddhist ethics combine the compassion of one who appreciates the pervasiveness of suffering with the practical wisdom that comes from a detailed experiential knowledge of what works. The result is a virtue called skill in means, upaya. In other words, it is the motive for behaving ethically, compassion. The framework within which to choose a course of action, wisdom, and the resources with which to act.
How do Shaivites honor Shiva?
Shivaratri, Shiva's night, is a monthly festivity occurring on the 14th night of the dark half of every lunar month, just before the appearance of the new moon. Once a year devotees observe Mahashivaratri, Shiva's great night, either during the midwinter lunar month called Magha or during the following month, Phalguna, depending on regional custom. The feast celebrates Shiva's manifestation of his power and glory to Vishnu and Brahma in the icon called the Jyotirlinga or fiery linga. Girls who hope to marry soon often fast during the day and keep vigil all night. Festivities in parts of India generally last all night and often include massive street parties and processions featuring elaborate floats, ecstatic dancing, and sometimes extreme demonstrations of devotion in the form of self-mutilation. A full moon feast during Kartika, in the fall, is called Tripuri Purnima. It recalls how Shiva incinerated the demon Tripura's 3 cities, Tripuri, made of gold, silver, and iron. Meanwhile his consort Kali dispatched the demon himself, ending his partial dominion over heaven, earth, and hell, the 3 cities.
What are the 3 bodies of the Buddha?
The concept of the 3 bodies, Trikaya, of the Buddha evolved as a way of explaining how the spiritual entity called the Buddha nature could transcend all earthly realities and at the same time manifest itself in the world. Pure Buddha nature existed in the Dharma body and was personified as the primal or universal Buddha, living in various heavenly abodes that made up the bliss body were the 5 principal meditational Buddhas. 1 ruling the center and 4 ruling the paradises at the 4 cardinal points. Transcendent Bodhisattvas assisted the celestial Buddhas in the work of salvation through grace. Involved in earthly affairs were the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who entered history in the manifestation body, subjecting themselves to time and change out of compassion for all suffering beings.
Could you sum up the Buddha's classical teaching on how a good life might unfold?
Any person who wishes to make sense of life must begin by hearing the Dharma. Seeking to understand the teaching of the utterly trustworthy Buddha. Translating the teaching into action means abiding by the fundamental recommendations and rules of conduct for living a moral life. Moving a step beyond the ethical minimum requires a person to seek greater personal discipline by guarding the senses and doing whatever is necessary to avoid the subtle corrosion of evil influences. That in turn inevitably leads to a higher level of mindfulness and awareness of each moment. This may seem at first to suggest a bland, even incredibly boring, life. But Buddhist tradition insists, paradoxically perhaps, that this alone can offer genuine appreciation and enjoyment, true bliss. Only such enlarged awareness is really worth the name living. For everything else is life on autopilot, a sure recipe for stress and frustration. At some point the seeker will need to pursue serious training in meditation. Meditative discipline aims immediately to help the seeker identify and neutralize sources of anxiety and uncertainty. A kind of spiritual map for serious seekers is called the 12-spoked wheel of conditioned arising. It describes in schematic fashion the cycle by which ignorance gives rise to intent to act, which in turn gives rise to consciousness, awareness of name and body, capacity for sense contact. Actual contact, sensation, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, old age, and death. The seeker must in effect work backward through the chain of conditions to eliminate the ignorance at the root. Those who persevere along this path hope to arrive at a genuinely contemplative approach to life and, ultimately, at spiritual liberation. This classical teaching clearly lays out a difficult and demanding path. Relatively few are able to follow it consistently. That is one of the reasons that more popular forms of Buddhist devotion and practice have had a broader appeal.
What is holy?
Originally a fertility festival, this late winter celebration of several days, ending with the full moon of Fulguna, is named after the demoness Holika. She was in the habit of eating a child each day until a holy widow summoned all the children to curse the demoness together. Amid great hubbub, participants today let out the kind of energy the children must have unleashed on Holika. They throw multicolored powders and liquids on each other, evidently a visual remnant of the children's curses. By a fascinating process of association, the celebration has also come to embrace the mythological downfall of evil female figures. For example, Krishna destroyed the demoness Putana, whom the evil king Kamsa had sent, disguised as a wet nurse, to kill the infant deity by poisoning him with her breast milk.
What are the main sub-communities or denominations within Buddhism?
There are three major subdivisions of the Buddhist tradition. Theravada, wisdom of the elders. Buddhism predominates in Sri Lanka and throughout most of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Vietnam. Of the over half dozen, some say as many as 18, so-called Hinayana, small vehicle schools that developed in India by the 2nd century BCE, the Theravada alone has survived in numbers into modern times. Mahayana, great vehicle, Buddhism in a large number of sub-denominations. And schools took hold particularly in northeastern Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism consists of several schools of esoteric thought and practice. They took hold particularly in the Himalayan region, in countries such as Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan.
Where do Buddhists live today? Are any estimates of numbers available?
Buddhism enjoyed much greater success in other parts of Asia than in India, the land of its birth. Estimates of the global population of Buddhists varies from about a third to 500 million. Political circumstances make statistics particularly hard to get for China and Tibet. But it is clear that Buddhists have suffered terribly in both areas during the past half-century. Meanwhile, the tradition has been enjoying modest revival elsewhere in Asia, and has become increasingly popular in Europe and North America as a result of both immigration and conversion. Nations with the highest percentage of Buddhists among the general population are Thailand, 94%, Cambodia, 90%, Myanmar, formerly Burma, 88%, Japan, 78%, and Korea, 45%. Many millions of Buddhists once lived in China, but their number dwindled dramatically with the advent of the communist system. Buddhism has been making a comeback in China in recent years, and there are now an estimated 13,000 temples and 200,000 monks and nuns. Tibet's population was, until recently at least, almost entirely Buddhist. Between 600,000 and 1 million Buddhists, representing all major denominations, live in the United States.
Are any feasts dedicated especially to the goddesses?
Durga Puja, also called Navaratri, 9 nights, occurs at the fall equinox in honor of Shiva's consort Durga. As the slayer of the buffalo demon, Durga Mahishasura Mardini. Durga represents the power of good to quell all sources of evil. Devotees celebrate this deity's complete protection of her worshippers. But Durga's festival has room for other deities as well. The first day celebrates the goddess Sarasvati, patroness of learning and beauty. In some regions the fifth day belongs to a goddess called Lalita. Bengalis sometimes still sacrifice water buffalo in honor of Durga's cosmic victory over evil. Another festival, occurring at the end of winter to welcome spring. is called Sri Panchami, goddess fifth day in the bright half of Magha. Devotees honor Sarasvati by piling up books and symbols of learning near local altars. Other days, such as several during the extended feast called Diwali, also belong to the major goddesses.
Are dreams and visions important in Hindu tradition?
Dreams and visions are often described as the means by which particularly holy individuals receive special knowledge or responsibilities. Spiritually advanced members of different denominations describe experiences in which their particular chosen deity appears and manifests his or her divine form. The deity's desires for the founding of a temple in a particular place are often communicated in dreams or visions. Traditional Hindu psychology considers dreaming one of the four ordinary states of consciousness. Founders of various denominations and sects often report dreams or visions as the impetus for a personal conversion or for proclaiming a new teaching.
Do Buddhists believe in an afterlife?
Although the Buddha himself emphasized the need to focus on this worldly concerns, his followers soon developed a complex understanding of the spiritual structure of the universe. According to both Theravada and Mahayana models, all of reality is divided into three realms. The realm of desire, Kamadhatu, encompasses everything from innumerable hells through the dwelling places of animals, humans, lesser gods, and the various paradises in which good people can expect to enjoy the fruits of a good life. Each level of hell is suited to a particular kind of selfishness and evil. The heavens are similarly graded for the enjoyment of the just. A certain sexist attitude is built into the notion of paradise. Since in order to gain entry into the highest heaven women must first be reborn as men. Those reborn into the next major level up, the realm of form, Rupadhatu, leave behind the senses of taste, touch, and smell. Through hearing, sight, and mental impressions they continue the ongoing process of spiritual refinement and education. Denizens of this realm's multiple heavens, from 16 to 18, progress upward through various stages of contemplative discipline, arriving finally at the third cosmic realm, that of non-form, Arupadhatu. Dispensing with sight and hearing, dwellers in this realm progress through four aditonal heavens through meditation, arriving at last at nirvana. Beyond that, according to some Mahayana schools, lie several Buddha fields. Transcendent Buddhas, such as Amitabha, in China, Amida in Japan, reign over their individual Buddha fields. Amitabha's is the western paradise called the Pure Land. Popular belief suggests that devotees can bypass the lower intermediate steps and progress directly to this final abode merely by expressing perfect faith in the transcendent Buddha.
What gender-related issues are important for Buddhists?
Tradition has it that the Buddha rejected various forms of social discrimination deeply embedded in the Indian culture of his day. He is said to have repudiated caste distinctions altogether. The Buddha's attitudes toward the place of women in religion and society also represented a step forward in some respects, but many problems remained. When the Buddha's aunt, who had raised him after his mother died, asked to be allowed into the Sangha, the Buddha balked. Only after a prominent monk named Ananda took up the woman's cause did the Buddha relent. So began the Buddhist order of nuns. But female members of the order have never achieved the status of their male counterparts. There has been a breakdown in the lineage of the nun Sangha, a complete rupture. According to some historians, some women continue to live in community and call themselves nuns, but they lack official sanction. A sore point for many women has been that classical Buddhist teaching says that women must be reborn as men before having a chance at nirvana. Still, it appears that early Buddhist tradition did introduce significant improvements in the lot of many women in India. No longer merely the possessions of their men, women had a larger purpose than childbearing, had personal psychic lives and could seek their own spiritual goals. So much of the gender bias that persists everywhere in our world has a great deal more to do with culture than with any one religious tradition as such. Interaction of religious tradition and culture often makes it impossible to distinguish between the two. But it is not uncommon for people in any given culture to claim religious sanction for time-honored values and practices even when the religious tradition's sources offer little support for them.
How and where do members of local Buddhist communities come together?
Temples are the focal point of Buddhist activity in most places. Many temples are freestanding institutions, while others are part of larger monastic complexes. At the heart of the temple is the primary ritual space. Some can accommodate sizable groups, but since ordinary Buddhist ritual tends to be an individual matter, central worship spaces are generally not strikingly capacious. Larger temples nowadays often have other facilities dedicated to communal functions on special occasions. People might visit their local temples individually or in smaller groups at any time on any day.
Do Buddhists believe in miracles?
Popular lore about the Buddha and numerous other holy personages is bursting with accounts of miracles. Buddhist tradition attributes far more miraculous deeds to the Buddha than almost any other tradition ascribes to a foundational figure. Scores of wonders occur at the moment of the Buddha's birth. All portents of the event's cosmic significance. Lamps all across the world lit themselves at that moment, the mute sang. The lame danced, and birds were suspended in their flight. The Buddha is said to have performed dozens of fabulous feats throughout his lifetime. Traveling great distances instantly, ascending into the air, subduing wild animals, and walking on water. Several of the wonders have become part of a canonical list of 8 great events, each associated with one of the cardinal or intermediate directions. Hard-headed realist that he was, the Buddha does not appear to have claimed miraculous powers of any sort. But within a short time of his death, tales of his superhuman powers multiplied. Important tales include 547 Jatakas, stories of the Buddha's previous lives as the Buddha to be, incarnated in myriad different forms. The Bodhisattva performs countless marvels on behalf of all suffering beings. Many other important Buddhist leaders have enjoyed similar notoriety. Founders of lineages, denominations, and monasteries from Tibet to Japan are said to have performed deeds like those attributed to the Buddha himself.
What does the rebirth of a non-self mean?
Buddhist tradition has devised various intricate ways of explaining this problem. One widely used image is that of a seal ring. Take a pad of warm wax and press the seal ring into it and you get a very clear impression. One that firms up as the wax cools. You've transferred something without actually leaving anything but an impression. The seal ring is something like what remains when a human being dies, still enslaved to inappropriate craving and desires. It represents the whole complex of psychic energies that make up a human personality. Energies so potent that most people are perfectly convinced of their individuality and separate personhood. In the cycle of death and rebirth, what transfers from one existence across the chasm of death into the wax of a new embodiment is precisely that incredibly powerful ego impulse. As the Buddha saw it, no one can be finally free so long as he or she clings to the notions of I, me, mine.
Do Hindus believe in devils?
No single personification of evil functions in Hindu tradition quite like the Satan of other traditions. Multiple embodiments of malice, perversity, and general negativity are called asuras, or demons. Ancient myths tell of the ongoing struggle between the devas, deities, and the demons for control of the cosmos. Originally, the demons were not necessarily considered altogether evil. Even their generic names are ambiguous. Deva is from the same root as devil, while Asura shows up in the name of the main Iranian deity, Ahura Mazda. Both deities and demons descended from Prajapati, lord of living things. Demons were at first ethically on a par with the gods, but the gods generally managed to win more battles than their siblings. Eventually the deities came to be known as more clever and more truthful. Finally, the gods achieved immortality while preventing the demons from winning that prize. Demons retained the ability to assume virtually any form in their attempts to disrupt cosmic affairs. Powerful people intent on evil could enlist the aid of demons to carry out their wicked deeds. Some demons came to represent impersonal negative qualities, such as ignorance. Lesser but still troublesome forces known as Buddhas remain important in the lives of many villagers. Buddhas are the spirits of those who died violently, or too young, or after betrothal but before marriage, for example. Resentful and frustrated, they wander about harassing the living unless appeased by proper rituals. Hindus believe that ultimately the divine power will overcome all demonic forces.
Does millennialism have a place in Buddhist thinking?
Buddhist interpretations of history, like those of Hindu tradition generally, are relatively unconcerned with notions like beginnings, progress, and endings. Time is so much grander than any human mind can fathom. Unimaginably large cycles give way to more of the same. But just as Hindu explanations of cosmic cycles can include a sense of expectation, so Buddhist tradition also makes room for a kind of Adventist thinking. Buddhists call the spiritual person or power whose future coming holds hope for all believers Maitreya, the benevolent one. 5,000 years after the death of this age's historical Buddha, the one originally called Siddhartha Gautama, Maitreya will enter the world of time and change. At present Maitreya lives as a bodhisattva in the heaven called Tushita. Contented ones, the celestial realm reserved for future Buddhas. Both Theravada and Mahayana traditions give Maitreya an important role. But devotion to this bodhisattva is much more developed in several Mahayana denominations. Classical Chinese teachings regarded Maitreya as a savior figure. But the cult of Amitabha gradually displaced that of Maitreya. Tibetan tradition holds that Maitreya will arrive in 30,000 years to teach all people. This bodhisattva has a long history of popular devotion in Korea and Japan under the name Myruk or Moroku. Colossal statues of Myruk stand on Korean hillsides and in temple compounds, some visible for several miles. And in Japan, Kyoto's ancient Kyuji temple enshrines an exquisite 6th century statue of Moroku. Gazing down on all who enter, the beautiful and very feminine-looking Moroku radiates compassion. Moving from the sublime to the deliberately ridiculous. A comical figure called Milo in China and Hodai in Japan represents another facet of Maitreya altogether. Hodai is depicted as a fat, jovial, scantily clad character. He is actually a Chinese Zen monk named Putai who claimed to be a manifestation of Maitreya.